And the first thing that I wanted to talk about in my opening remarks is I actually got some bad news today. And the bad news that I got is that somebody that has been a longtime friend, not someone I was deeply close to, but somebody that I did know and someone that I loved. I really did have love for this person. He was just a very kind, genuine person, an optimistic person. He died. And that person was somebody that, he was at Occupy Wall Street when I was at Occupy Wall Street. He was involved in all kinds of anti-war activism. I was also involved in. He was a socialist and a leftist that I was involved in. He was a great man in so many ways. Paul Gilman, he died, and I did not know this. I got the news rather late. Apparently, he died at the end of May, which is shocking for me because I interviewed him on May 1st at the Palestine rally that happened. I interviewed him, and I'd interviewed him a number of times, and I actually went through some of my old YouTube videos, and I found clips of Paul, and I want to tell you about Paul. I want to talk to you all about Paul. So here are two clips of Paul from Palestine rallies where I interviewed him. One was many years ago, and the other one was the more recent one in May, which was just a couple weeks before he died. He apparently died at the end of May. So this is Paul at Palestine rallies.
Lives do matter, but so do Palestinian lives matter. And for them, they mean only Jewish lives matter. They don't care about anyone else. It's showing the true teeth of the oppression of this country. They say we're a free country, but the minute we do something they don't like, they send the cops in on us. If that's not fascism, I don't know what is.
So I want to tell you the context, right? So this first interview, this was at the height of Black Lives Matter, at the Black Lives Matter protests. The pro-Israel forces in New York City decided to have a rally called Jewish Lives Matter. And it was basically saying you have to support Israel because Jewish lives matter. And he protested it. And that's the comment that he's making, that he made. I was working for Press TV. This is years before I even worked at RT, right? This is over a decade ago. And he was a Green Party candidate for New York City Council, I believe. And he said,
Jewish lives do matter, but so
he's saying Jewish lives do matter, obviously.
the Palestinian lives matter. And for them, they mean only Jewish lives matter. They don't care about anyone else. It's showing.
And that was what he was saying. He said, look, we don't obviously disagree that Jewish lives matter. We don't want Jewish people to be harmed. But what about Palestinians? And that was a good point. And then this is him talking about the crackdown on pro-Palestine protests that happened across the country. I interviewed him about that on May 1st. And this is, very recently. This is just before he passed.
It's showing the true teeth of the oppression of this country. They say we're a free country, but the minute we do something they don't like, they send the cops in on us. If that's not fascism, I don't know what is.
Yeah, and so that was on May 1st at the Palestine rally. So I've got some other video of Paul, but I want to tell you about Paul, right? Because that's the tricky thing. When somebody is alive, you don't know, and I'm constantly wondering what the right thing is. If someone's alive, you don't want to talk too much about them and their personal life and their background and their life story on YouTube channels because you don't know how much they want to keep private. But Paul is now deceased. So I'll tell you what I knew about Paul. And then we'll watch some more footage of Paul. Paul loved marijuana. All right. And you can see that in the clip I just showed. He's wearing a baseball cap with a pot leaf on it. Paul loved marijuana. And the way Paul got to be political was that Paul was apparently a marijuana dealer as a young man. And he got arrested. And he did some serious prison time in upstate New York. He was a young man. I don't know where he's originally from, but he was a pot dealer. Nowadays they're much more soft on that kind of thing, but Rockefeller drug laws, etc. He was a pot dealer, and he ended up doing some serious prison time. And it was during that prison time that Paul became political, and it was in prison that he started reading. He started reading the political stuff. He started reading about the Black Panthers. He started reading about socialism and communism. and he came out of prison as somebody that was an activist, right? I think this was in like the 70s or 80s. I think it was the 80s that he went to prison. And he came out of prison politicized, right? Because there was a movement, what they called a movement in those days. And there was, and he came out of prison as somebody who admired the Black Panthers, and he admired Native American activists. And as a result of being in prison, and in prison, you have a lot of time to read. And that there's many people who, maybe not as much anymore, but at one point, there were a lot of people who got very politicized in prison because they would read books, and books were available. And so he came out of prison as a politicized person. And Paul had a very hard time. I mean, being a convicted felon, it was not easy for Paul. But Paul was at all the rallies. He was at every anti-war rally that the Workers' World Party organized. He was at all kinds of demonstrations. And Paul was a communist. I don't think he was ever in any party or group, but he was very much a communist. And more specifically, he was a Maoist. And that's a bit of a contradiction because Mao Zedong was not a big fan of drugs, but, he was a marijuana legalization activist. And he was a Maoist communist. And my fondest memory of Paul is in 2019, I gave a class. This is before CPI got started. We had something called Students and Youth for a New America. And Students and Youth for a New America never really turned into a real group. It was always just kind of, there were a couple people in one or two campuses doing something, and I would rent a studio classroom in New York City and do something. So we rented a studio in New York City, and I did a class called Mao Zedong and American Socialists. That's what I called it. I had no idea that Paul was coming. But Paul showed up to the class, total surprise to me. I knew Paul from protests. He was a friendly guy, but I'd never been over to his home, and I didn't know him intimately, but he showed up. He brought his girlfriend with him, and he brought books of his own to the class, and he was so into it. And, I'm going to show you the contribution that Paul made to my Mao and American Socialist class. I'm just going to show it to you because when you watch it, you can tell how into communism and into Chinese communism Paul really was. He was a history buff. He was a communist activist, I'll get to that, Noah, but Paul is one of the many unsung heroes. We need to talk about people like Paul, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, Noah, but there's so many great people like this, and we need to talk about people like this. And I'll get to that later. But let's just watch, and we're going to watch Paul's contributions to my Mao class. This is what Paul said, the contributions he made to my class on Chinese history, filling in the gaps of where I missed it, talking about what he thought was important.
Chiang Kai-shek had killed Mao's first wife and sister.
Wow.
And it was Stalin that ordered, and they were deciding what to do. It was Stalin that was said, well, you got to form a united front with the KMT. And, like Mao and his party were still deciding what to do, Stalin stepped in and did it. Now, the reason the generals did it was two reasons, right? The first reason is because the KMT refused to fight the Japanese. They had retreated as far as in western China as you can get and still be in China. They were in Chongqing, and they were hoping that the Japanese fascists and the Manchukuo would wipe out all the communists. They couldn't do it. By then, the communists were in Yan'an, which is after the Long March. They had made it there. Now, in the very beginning, you kind of left this part out, which is kind of important. When Trotsky and all of them were talking about a united front with the KMT, the Soviet Union had sent a general, and they founded what they called the Whampoa Military Academy. The Whampoa Military Academy is where both sides started getting their armies. An interesting note to that, Chiang Kai-shek was the the president or the chancellor, whatever they call the head of that. The political commissar was Chou En-lai. And on a little interesting minutiae side note, Ho Chi Minh was the translator because he could speak Chinese, Russian, and Vietnamese. He was in, when they found, he was in Moscow, part of the Comintern. So Ho Chi Minh was the translator between the Russians and the Chinese. The Dalai Lama himself admitted that Mao was a great man. And you always see the hints of, in the Bertolucci film on the Tibetan Lama, when he's leaving, the last thing they did was commit human sacrifices, these lamas. Yeah. And this is actually hinted in the movie where the guy who plays the Dalai Lama turns and says, is this necessary? And the reactionary a-holes that are actually the political powers in Tibet say, yes, it is.
So here's a funny story. I'll just share this before Paul continues. Speaking of the Dalai Lama, I just remembered this, but, I used to do a lot of activism near Union Square. Union Square, the political group I was working with, they had their headquarters like up on 17th Street, which was, pretty close to Union Square. And Paul used to just hang out in Union Square, right? I think he would, get baked and he would smoke his pot and he would be just kind of hanging out in Union Square sometimes or whatever. So one day, me and a couple of friends, we were in Union Square and we saw the Dalai Lama, the Tibet separatists had gathered and they were having an anti-China demonstration. So they were having an anti-China demonstration, and I remember, me and a couple of my friends, we wanted to disrupt it, and I had the little red book by Mao, and so we walked by it, and we just started waving the little red book and chanting Mao, Mao, Mao Zedong. We did not know that Paul was there. Paul was just kind of there hanging out, and so we were disrupting, kind of, shouting at the Dalai Lama, the Tibet separatists, as they were protesting, and we held up our red books and we were chanting like Mao, Mao, Mao Zedong. And Paul, out of nowhere, Paul appears and he's laughing his head off, and he's just got this big grin on his face, like, he was totally surprised that we were there, and he, being somebody who was a sympathizer with Chinese communism, he got a big grin on his face and he was like giving us a thumbs up and he was like, yeah, that's awesome. We made his day. We made Paul's day by disrupting the Dalai Lama Tibet separatist rally that was happening in Union Square when he just happened to be hanging out in Union Square.
Point out another.
It was kind of sweet. So there we go.
Sacrifices, these lamas. Yeah. And this is actually hinted in the movie where the guy who plays the Dalai Lama turns and says, is this necessary? And the reactionary a-holes that are actually the political powers in Tibet say, yes, it is. And I want to point out another book. This is C.K. Yang's book. C.K. Yang was a American sociologist from Hawaii who actually went to China. I think this was his ancestral village in southern China. And C.K. Yang did a really intense, minute sociological study of this village, and the big thing was the oppression of women, which was, he wrote about that extensively, and the hierarchies within the Chinese family, and then he also wrote about the oppressions. So that was from 47 to 48, and then from 49 to 50, he was in the same village. He was there for 4 years. He studied the transition to communism, and it should be a companion to Hinton. And I want to say one thing about Hinton's Fan Shin, the most, and this is a neglected book. I think all Marxists or people should actually read it. It's very dense, it's boring, it takes a while to get through, but it's worth it, But I'll admit it, I did it, I finished it. Okay, the most powerful, Hinton's book talks about the bottom-up transformation of Longbo, the village you mentioned, and one of the most powerful chapters is when half the world stood up, and it's all about the liberation of women. And the Communist Party didn't go in these villages and do this order and boss people around. They would send 2 or 3 cadres in there and find out who are the poorest peasants and have them lead the social movement. They would give them a little bit of training and do it. And in this, by then, Longboat was firmly in communist hands. They were doing the numerous land redistributions. And this chapter, when half the world stood up, this woman was complaining to the cadres how her husband was beating her. So so they said, okay, well, they get all the women and they do what they call consciousness raising thing, which actually eventually was a big, powerful movement within the feminist movement. So they did this conscious, and all these women were talking about their husbands, and a few of the husbands were cool, but many of them were cruel. So they got together, they went after that woman's husband, and they gave him a chance to either apologize or leave. He refused, so they beat him up. And then they went to all the bad husbands, and there was like a little bit of a counter thing, and some of the husbands said they're sorry and learned their lessons. Some were just complete assholes. They kicked their asses and they chased them out of the village. And then the big thing with this, and even in this movie, was a transformation of women in the revolution, because they were the most oppressed. I'm agreeing everything you said, and I'm just expounding, sorry about that.
Yeah. Any other comments? And then I have some conclusions before we conclude.
Except Paul, no Paul comments.
Yeah, come on, Sanders.
He's a dapper gentleman.
Hey, I really appreciate this whole lecture. It was great. Unfortunately, 2 hours is not enough.
Yeah.
No.
So I cannot complain that you had to skim over certain parts. There's nothing you could do about it. I'd like to comment on your opening statements with the racism. And there is a certain, I wouldn't call it racist in the American left, but it's certainly Eurocentric chauvinism, that's what I would call it, are totally dismissive of the Chinese Revolution and do not take it serious as a topic. It's really frustrating because now you have a mass insurgency in India, the Naxalites, that are also based on Maoist principles. I mean, it's a big mess, but no one's even studying it. Whether you support it, whatever, there's very little interest in it, which is fascinating. And another aspect that I also found concurrent with the chauvinism is that the Chinese Revolution was very female-centric, in the sense that I mentioned C.K. Yang and the oppression of women. Well, Pearl Buck wrote, she wrote The Good Earth, right? Now, Pearl Buck spoke Chinese, she lived there and everything. Everything that C.K. Yang wrote is confirmed in Pearl Buck's book, The Good Earth, and people read the Pearl Buck's book and Good Earth and think it's about peasants bettering themselves through hard work and everything. That's really the subplot. The real plot of the book is the oppression of women, and that never comes out in any real discussion of it. And I think so there's not only the Eurocentric chauvinism against anything that doesn't come out of Lenin or Trotsky. And I love Lenin and Trotsky, and I love, I'm not putting them down. Marx was not a Eurocentric chauvinist, neither was Lenin. But a lot of their followers and a lot of the things that came afterwards were.
Yeah, and that was Paul. Paul was really well read, and he was really dedicated, and he would come to every rally. He ran for office as the Green Party candidate for city council a number of times. He was just kind of a fixture of radical circles. And I'll tell you another Paul story that comes to mind, because Paul told me this many times. He told me this story. And I guess I'm going to tell this story not because the story itself is necessarily so important, but because of how important it was to Paul. I think Paul told me this story at least 7 or 8 times. Almost every time I saw Paul, he would tell me about this. And I guess Paul had a son. I never met his son, but he said he had a son who was disabled, had, special needs. And I guess he would always tell this to me, but the political group I was in for years was the Workers' World Party. And he told me that one time at the Workers' World Party office, they had a movie showing, and he brought his son, who was special needs, to the movie showing. And his son started making a scene and acting up. And Paul was really, really embarrassed about that. And the people in the Workers' World Party were really, really nice to Paul about it. You know, they didn't, they weren't mean, they weren't annoyed. And Paul was just so moved by how kind they had been to him when his son, who had come to the movie showing, had been so disruptive and so, had made such a scene and been so rude. And he said he had gone and apologized to the party leaders, and they said, "Don't worry about it. It's fine." He said, "I won't bring him back to another event." And they said, "No, you can bring him back. If you can judge, you're his father. You'll know if it's right or not." And Paul told me that story 7 or 8 times because it was really, really important to him, because I think he was really embarrassed about his son who had special needs and how his son had acted. And the fact that the political group I was in didn't give him trouble about it, and even told him that he was welcome to bring his son back. When he was apologizing for his son disrupting the movie scene, they said, and that always came up because I was with that. I knew Paul when I was with the political group I was with, and I knew him afterwards. And anytime I mentioned the Workers' World Party, Paul would just tell me that story. Well, one time I brought my son to the event and he made a scene, and I was so embarrassed and I apologized. And they even told me that I could bring him back. And it was so kind. That was what Paul remembered about the political group I was with, was that incident. And it shows how important kindness is to people, that a little bit of kindness can go a long way. If you said Workers' World Party to Paul, what immediately came to Paul's mind was, this is the group of people that were so nice to me after my son made a scene at the event, and that's something that I think a lot of people really forget, right? Is that an act of kindness like that, can really mean something. And that, and I don't know where Paul's son is. I don't know who the mother of Paul's son is. I don't know anything about that. But I do know that Paul, Paul had been in prison. Paul had become a communist in prison. Paul had gotten out of prison, and that Paul was just a well-known activist figure in New York City, Green Party candidate for office, and that Paul struggled. There were times when Paul was homeless. He was not usually homeless. He usually had a place to live. But there were times where, Paul was struggling to find housing. Because he was a convicted felon, and having a drug dealing conviction on your record, it makes it hard to find a job. And there were times I would just run into Paul on the streets of New York. Sometimes I would see him in coffee shops. I would see him near Union Square, and he knew me. And also, when the cancel culture got going against me, a lot of the people that I worked with in communist groups, they would see me and they would look the other way. I'd see them on the street and they would look the other way, like they didn't know me. Not Paul. And Paul would always greet me, and Paul would always say, "Oh, I don't care for that. Everyone's always fighting on the internet." That was Paul's attitude. And he thought I was a fun guy to talk to because I was interested in history the same way he was interested in history. I was clearly a dedicated activist, as was he. He watched RT. And that was one thing I thought was neat about Paul, is because he had an anti-imperialist orientation, he watched RT. And when I started working for RT full time, I remember I ran into Paul one time and he had this big grin. He's like, "I see you on RT all the time, Caleb. Whoa, you're on there like every night, man. That's awesome." Like, he watched RT because he had been an anti-war activist, because he was, against the government and wanted to legalize marijuana. He watched RT. And so when I started being the RT reporter, he got really excited about it. And I want to tell you the stories about guys like Paul, right? And Noah said, what did Noah say earlier? He said, "I've never heard of Paul." Well, no, you wouldn't have heard of Paul. Paul is one of the unsung heroes, right? Never heard of Paul Gilman. What you're describing sounds like a lot of new communist movement activists. That's very true. But people like Paul are heroes. right? And that's what I want to do, stories like this about people like Paul, right? I want to talk about people like Marty Goodman, right? I want to talk about them because, you know, when I was in Russia for the planning meeting of the World Youth Festival, they talked about how one thing that the Russian government right now is really promoting and encouraging people to believe and to understand is that anyone can be a hero. Ordinary people can be heroes just by doing the right thing, just by protecting their community. And they talk about how during World War II, millions of Russian people became heroes because the Nazis invaded their homeland, and 27 million people in Russia gave their lives to drive out the invaders. And there were heroes in every town and every village and every corner of the country. And there needed to be heroes, or else they would have never been able to defeat the Nazi invaders. And that is a really important point, because just like Marty Goodman was a hero who organized Free Assange rallies, and even if there was just 5 people there, he was there. Paul is a hero. And this is what I would like people to understand. I think it is more important in a sense to do biographies of people like Paul and people like Marty, because we need more people like them. Let me just tell you, if we're going to save our country, we need more people like Paul and more people like Marty and more people that just do it, that see the job needs to be done. They need to build a movement. We need to build a movement against war and against the low-wage police state. And we need people who just do it. And it's these unsung heroes. These are the people that make a movement. You think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., there were millions of guys like Paul who made Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We think that one man made the civil rights movement, but that's not true. Behind Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., there were millions and millions of people like Paul, and there were millions and millions of people like Marty Goodman, and that we need people to do that. And that, unfortunately, because of social media and because of the way our culture is, people have it in their mind that that if you're not the center of attention, and if you're not, in the spotlight, that you don't count. And that's not true. That is not true at all. Everybody in the activist scene in New York City loved Paul Gilman. In fact, the way that I found out about his death was that a friend of mine who has run for city council, she was just a city council candidate who was part of Occupy Wall Street. She wrote an article honoring her friend Paul, and it was a member of our community. Shout out to Peter L. Peter L. saw the article that Marnie wrote, and he sent it to me, and that's how I got the news today, because Paul was a hero to everyone he interacted with. I want to show you something about Paul. This is one thing I will never forget about Paul, right? And I'm going to turn the sound off. I just want you to look at Paul's face. There was always a twinkle in his eyes. He was always happy. There was always a twinkle in his eyes. There was always a grin on his face. Look at that. That's Paul, right? There was always kind of a happiness, a playfulness, an honesty underlying everything that he did. Paul had been through, this guy had been in prison for a long time. I think almost a decade, maybe longer than that. I don't know how long exactly, but he did some serious prison time, right? And, he was missing teeth, and he'd had some hardship in his life, but he just had this happiness, right? When you saw him, there was this twinkle in his eyes. There was this optimism about him. He stayed optimistic through all the hardship that he'd been through. And he wasn't just a communist on the internet. He was a communist activist. He needed to be part of the movement, right? He was at every protest he could get to. He was at every demonstration, because it was like That's what fed that happiness. He had that twinkle in his eye. He had that playfulness. He had that kindness. And that came from being part of a movement, right? From being part of an organization, not necessarily, I don't think he was in any particular party, but being involved in community struggles to change the world. You know, if you looked at his face, there was always this kind of glow, because for him, you know, he read about communism. He'd read every book ever. He was a big history buff, but it wasn't just a matter of knowing about it in an academic or intellectual way. For him, it was a practice. It was a movement that he was part of. And he saw that I was doing this class, and he totally surprised me back in 2019. I had no idea. When Paul walked in with his girlfriend at the time, and he brought like a stack of like 4 books about Mao, and he was just so excited that anyone was doing a class on Chinese communism. He wasn't going to miss it. When he walked in, I mean, he was so excited, and he had this happiness on his face. Like this, I'm telling you about, this is why I will never stop being a revolutionary activist. It's because of people like Paul, right? People like Paul. You meet people like Paul when you do revolutionary organizing, right? He was 64 when he died. He was 64 years old at the time of his death. And you meet people like Paul who are inspired, people who are passionate about ideas, people who want to struggle for truth and justice. And that is why, I mean, I have been a revolutionary organizer, not just because I believe in the cause, but because it gives me joy.